Hello everybody, and thank you for coming to our session. Welcome to NFC development for BlackBerry 10, deep dive in brackets, or how I learned to love NFC. You may or may not agree with that statement at the end of this session. We will see. My name is Martin Woolley. I work for BlackBerry's developer relations team. I'm based in the UK, and I've been working with software development now for several decades. I don't like to say it out loud, it makes me feel bad. But for the last couple of years, I've been working almost exclusively with NFC, and I like to say that NFC discovered me, and we've been happy together ever since. It's a very interesting area. And I'm co-presenting today with my colleague, John.
Thank you, Martin. My name is John Murray. I'm also a member of the developer relations team and also based in the UK. I also have a long time in software development, and I was hijacked by NFC perhaps a couple of years ago, and have continued to love it ever since.
Thanks, John. So John and I spend most of our time working with our developer partners, with people like carriers who are working to develop solutions that exploit NFC in various ways. Now, BlackBerry 10 has been some time coming. You're probably aware of that, and I'm probably bringing back songs that maybe you never wanted to hear again, I don't know. But it's interesting to reflect on what we first offered in Beta 1. Now, how many of you, if you could raise your hand, were looking at BlackBerry 10 right back in the summer of last year when we released Beta 1? Okay, thank you. A few of you, you'll probably recall and recognize the fact that things have changed a lot since then. And in a way, that's the backdrop to this session. In Beta 1, released in May or June of last year, you could do an awful lot with the device as it was at that time, with the Dev Alpha A that we issued to developers. Nevertheless, it's changed a great deal, and these days you have lots of choices that you didn't have back then. Back then, you could do things one way. Today, there's lots of choices as to how you approach various aspects of application development, including those that relate to NFC. Okay, different parts of your architecture that can have NFC functionality implemented in it, different APIs that are available to you. So now we've got choices, so now we need to learn how to make those choices. And what we'd like to do is talk about the way those APIs have evolved, and then spend some time looking at the most recent capabilities that we've released through Beta 3 and Beta 4 and through the Gold SDKs, and John's going to cover that side of things. And then I'm going to talk about what we call the BPS APIs. BPS is BlackBerry Platform Services, a collection of C APIs. And we'll look at that so we know what it looks like. And then John's going to kind of compare the two and point out differences and help us, I guess, understand the different characteristics, the pros and cons, what we can do with one and not with the other, and so on, so that we're armed with the right knowledge to make choices. Okay? And then we'll close, and hopefully there'll be time for some questions at the end. So if you could keep questions until the end, we'd appreciate that. We're around for the whole 2 days anyway, so if we run out of time for questions, don't worry. Just come and find us, or follow us on Twitter. We'll give details at the end, and we'll enjoy getting in a conversation with you. So I'm going to start off with a very brief NFC 101, if you like. Are there people in the audience, if you could raise your hand, who are quite new to NFC? Okay, good, thank you. So for you guys, we'll just do a brief intro to NFC, and then we'll move on into the main part of the session. So it stands for Near Field Communications. You probably knew that already. And the near part of the term refers to the range that NFC has. It's very short range. It's between 2 and 4 centimeters. Typically, it'll be less than 4. Environmental factors and materials and things like that will affect the range that NFC has. But it's pretty short range, and NFC devices need to be held close to each other or touch to function. Touch is a really key word in the world of NFC, and in a way, it's why it's of interest to us in this room and to people out in the industry who are doing things with NFC today, because it makes it possible for end users to make things happen just by touching something in the physical world with their BlackBerry 10 smartphone, for example. So suddenly the world becomes very interactive from software, and this can make things exciting, fun, or simply more convenient for the user, and this is why there's interest in NFC. We turned the world into a physically interactive place where I can make things happen across a whole range of things, from paying for my goods in a shop through to launching a web page. That's embedded in an advertisement in a poster just by touching the poster because I'm quite interested in that product. Lots of things can be done. NFC is governed by a whole range of technical standards. This is really important. There's a body called the NFC Forum, who of course have a website, and they are charged with governing many of the standards around NFC in conjunction with other standards bodies like the International Standards Organization. Why do we care about this? We care about it because interoperability is really important. I keep hearing this phrase, the Internet of Things, and I think I like the phrase. I didn't invent it, but yeah, I kind of get what people are saying there. It's about things, physical things, suddenly becoming able to interact with each other over these short-range NFC radio interfaces. And that wouldn't be possible without standards. You know, a BlackBerry 10 smartphone needs to be able to interact and share a photograph, for example, with an Android device from HTC. Of course, they need to work together, so interoperability is really important. Otherwise, the technology will not be adopted en masse. If users have a bad experience, my phone doesn't work with your phone, and so on. So we're really big on standards at BlackBerry. I keep wanting to call us RIM, but we're BlackBerry now. And consequently, you'll find that you know, things like NFC tags, if you know what they are, we support the standard types only. There are some proprietary ones out there. We don't support them, and we think it's a bad idea to support them because we want to discourage proprietary solutions and encourage compliance with the standards because that's good for everybody, most of all the consumer. And NFC, finally, it's a lot more than just radio, a short-range radio. When NFC was designed, it was designed with various use cases in mind. And those use cases, which included things like payment, but that's one of 1,000 possibilities, need other capabilities and components around the radio bits. So there's almost a solution architecture and a series of concepts and capabilities that wrap around NFC and make it possible for you to do interesting and, above all, useful things. It's not good enough for them to just be interesting or cool. They've got to be useful for people to want to use them. So what can we do with NFC? Very briefly, I kind of break it down into these 4 areas. You can split it down in various different ways. With things called NFC tags, of which I have some over here. If you haven't ever seen an NFC tag, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but typically they're made of paper or card. They have circuitry inside them, and they're kind of memory cards. This is actually a ticket for the trains here. This is an NFC card. And they contain data. And NFC tags are used to trigger actions involving the data that they contain. So from the user's point of view, they touch something which has an NFC tag inside it or attached to it in some way, and something happens. And that something is governed by you guys, because it's an application that gets launched and gets given the data, and what happens next is down to you. You've got the full wealth of BlackBerry 10 APIs available to you, and you have some data that just magically arrived over a contactless interface by the user just touching. You can now do whatever you want. Extremely flexible, all sorts of possibilities. With our technology, your creativity, who knows what we can achieve. You can also transfer data through NFC's peer-to-peer mode, and this is where I get 2 devices, bring them together, and transfer something like a photograph, or a music file, or a contact card from my address book, or some proprietary data that my game needs to transfer from player 1 to player 2. So I can go from device to device using peer-to-peer mode. We can perform something called card emulation. Card emulation's a bit tricky to explain, but essentially, we can use our BlackBerry 10 smartphone in place of a smart card. And smart cards are everywhere in society these days. Outside the United States, at the very least, credit cards are smart cards. The ID card I used to get in the building at work, it's a smart card. And we can emulate these things in software on a suitably equipped smartphone, such as the BlackBerry 10 smartphone, which has a special component called a secure element in it, which can host security-sensitive software used in authentication protocols and things like this. And it can have a conversation over the NFC contactless interface with a reader by a door, so it will open and let me in, or with a reader in a shop, a point-of-sale reader. And instead of having plastic cards in my leather wallet, I have my emulated cards in software in the secure element in the BlackBerry 10 device. And I can have lots of emulated cards in the same physical smartphone, just like my wallet. Okay? So all sorts of things there, and that's probably the use of NFC that will affect the most people, because the credit card issuers are investing in this big time and rolling out contactless infrastructure into retail outlets. Last but not least, we can read contactless cards right into our applications and use the data that we find there. So the tickets for the trains and buses here in Amsterdam, they're contactless cards. You can read data off them. You can find out the last 2 transactions. So for users who want to know the usage history, give them an application. They just touch the ticket to their smartphone. Your application receives the data and displays it. So all sorts of things you can do with NFC. Now, backdrop to this session is a kind of journey, an evolution. Back in the summer of last year, we released beta 1 of the BlackBerry 10 APIs. And in so doing, we released some NFC APIs that were exposed as some C functions. And this is the BlackBerry Platform Services, and I'll talk about that in the second part of this session. But later on, as further beta releases were made, we gave developers the ability to invoke all sorts of NFC operations direct from within Cascades, with some high-level classes that are very easy to use, and even the ability to do some things from QML. Again, and this is what John's going to talk about. So now we have both, and we have flexibility, and this is where we'd like to discuss with you what those options are, what the strengths and weaknesses are of the different options that you now have, and maybe how we'd approach things, not that you have to do it the same way. So, on that point, I'm going to hand over to John, and he's going to start talking about the most recent additions to the BlackBerry 10 NFC APIs. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Martin. Even though the NFC APIs evolve chronologically, as we said, we're not taking that approach today. We're going to take the approach where what perhaps are the APIs you would start using as a developer who wanted to touch your, get your toes in the water with NFC. Ultimately, ultimately we'd probably want to get to the point where most of the ability to access NFC capabilities was perhaps at a very high level like QML or even in JavaScript. And what we're going to do is see how today we're going to sort of see how far along that journey we have got to that point from where we were perhaps a year ago. So there's probably 3 things we want to cover, 3 important topics. If you want to understand how to access and use NFC from the sort of highest level APIs that we have in QML and JavaScript. We need to know something about the Invocation Framework. This is central. This capability is central to BlackBerry 10. Knowing about it is fundamental to understanding how you can hook applications together and how you can integrate capabilities into your application. And the second 2 are a couple of really very important classes that are, well, the NFC Shares Manager is a class. It's a very useful class for sharing data and making that very, very simple. And the other thing we want to do is talk about invoke action item. If you deal primarily with QML and you want to interact with NFC, some capabilities of NFC through QML, you need to look at that. Invoke action item. So how far have we got along this? How far have we got along the goal to perhaps doing as much as we could possibly do within QML and JavaScript? I'll let you be the judge of that towards the end. So we need to talk a little bit about the Invocation Framework. Put it in context. So the Invocation Framework here is very much like a broker. It has clients and it has targets. A typical question that a client of the Invocation Framework might ask, can I open a file of doc or .xml or .pdf or something? Because I don't know how to do it myself. talks to the Invocation Framework. The Invocation Framework locates candidate applications that have registered with the framework that they are able to open a particular type of file or perform a particular type of task. So, in this case, we have two particular applications which are invocation targets. So it's important to get the roles, client and target, because your application may adopt one or other of those roles simultaneously at any time, depending on what service you're talking to. Get your head around the invocation framework. It's fundamental to making things easy and developing really cool applications on BlackBerry 10, because somebody else will probably have done what you want to do, leverage it. So, how does the invocation framework work with NFC? We had two roles. Remember, there was a client and a target. Let's suppose that in this particular case, suppose the NFC stack, the NFC service in the device is acting as a client to the invocation framework, right? So he says, I've just read a tag of type ... And your application says, I'm interested in tag types of ... You've already registered. In this particular case, we'll say type U tags. That's URI tags. You've said, I'm interested in those. So you register your application with the Invocation Framework. The BlackBerry service, NFC service says, I just read one. The Invocation Framework locates you and therefore can invoke your application as a target. You get notified on the reading of a tag of a particular type. That's one role where the NFC service is the client and your application is the target. The other role is, suppose your client, your application is acting as a client. You say, I want as my application to share a photograph or share some data by NFC, right? Hopefully, there's some other application out there that knows how to do this, because I don't really want to be bothered with the details of the, of how I actually communicate with a card. I'm operating at the level of QML and JavaScript. I want somebody else to do it. Now, hopefully, and of course there is, part of the system has already registered with the Invocation Framework that says, I know what to do with NFC. I know how to write data out to an NFC device or a peer. So you say, I want to send my photograph. Can anybody help? You locate, the Invocation Framework locates candidate applications that can share photographs over NFC, and of course it finds one. Data interchange, bang, you've just actually shared a photograph over NFC or data over NFC without knowing how to talk to a tag yourself. Use the Invocation Framework wherever possible. Very, very powerful capability. So, let's look at some of the specific use cases around how you would perform certain tasks using the Invocation Framework. Let's look at reading tags. So, I'm not going to labor the point on this one, but I think this particular, what we have here is part of the bar descriptor file for your application. Bar descriptor file is a little bit like a manifest file for your application. It describes your attributes of your application. In this particular case, what we basically said here is that we're interested in tags. We're interested when the system identifies has read a tag, and by specifying this sort of stanza in your application, you can cause your application not only to receive information about the tag that's been read, but be launched as well. So it's launching of your application and being notified of the tag that's being presented. Points to note, we say we're prepared to open NFC tags. This is basically, we establish this particular relationship with the Invocation Framework. The MIME type there is basically one that identifies the fact that we're interested, we're capable of handling NDEF data, NFC NDEF data. We can do that. We know how to do that. and in particular because there's various types of tags out there, various types of content. We specify this a little bit more precisely by the property attribute here, the URIs attribute. This is basically a simple specification of a particular tag type that we're interested in. Type 4, TNF type 4 basically says it's an external type, custom type tag. I've invented that for my own because it's private to my application, and I want to use that without collisions with other applications that may actually want to use NFC NDEF as well. So TNF type 4, and I specify some other information here that basically becomes the record type of the tag that I'm interested in. So that's me registering with the NDEF, the Invocation Framework. In C++, what I do is I use the Invocation Manager, hook up some signals and slots together, which basically notifies me of an event when a tag has been presented to the device. So, registering for a tag and having your application launched on the presentation of a particular type of tag is actually very simple. And the Invocation Manager is used to present you with the data. You just need to handle the plumbing. There's an example of this. All our examples are actually on GitHub. You'll find them here. Go to this one, you'll find an application called NFC Tool. So, reading tags, relatively straightforward, relatively simple. Let's now look at another use case, sharing data over NFC using QML again. So, we get to the point where we actually have a demo here. What you're going to see, let me tell you what you're going to see, then I'll show you what you will see, and then I'll tell you what you saw. Basically, I'm going to show you sending a vCard between two devices. The devices are different to show you that we're using standards, and therefore across different types of devices, everything works. So we're going to do it from a BlackBerry 10 device here. We're going to construct a vCard and send it over NFC to, in my case, a 9700. What I want to point out, and it's actually very, very careful to point out, is this icon down here. Right? It's on the action bar at the bottom, Share NFC. Remember that. Keep that in your mind. But you can see basically you fill out some fields on this, the application. This again is part of an application called NFC Tool Lite, which is in GitHub. You can download the source for this. Go and look at it. It's very educational. So the name, first name, address, email, mobile number. And we want to send that across to target device. Share a contact. All right? Share a vCard. Let's actually do that. So if I switch over to 8. So here's my target device, and here's my source device. All right? Running the NFC tool application. You can see that there's an option there to send a vCard, and like we said, contains details of a Mr. Fred Flintstone. So, what do? I press Share NFC. Notice how it launches a card. Now I'm going to touch these two devices. Yeah. So I've received a content, and the contents of the vCard are automatically transferred. Can't read that? It's okay, right. Ultimately transferred to this other device over NFC. Now, an important point, if we can zoom in a little bit in that. Now, an important point about this is, you notice that I was running an application on this side, I pressed share. There was no application running on this side because the NFC service on BlackBerry devices knows what to do with vCards. If it receives one over NFC, it knows to launch the contacts application and knows to give you the option to add the card in, the contact into the contacts application. So, let's look at this in a little bit more detail. what actually happened there? Well, the process that you would go through here is that first thing my app did was query the Invocation Framework and try and find a helper application, basically, that will perform transfer of NDEF record for me. I invoke that. I set the payload, which will be a vCard in NDEF format. And then the helper application, which you saw come across as a card in the BlackBerry 10 device, will come and complete the operation and write the data out over NFC for you. So we're making use of a helper application. Now, so some of this is in, a lot of this will actually be in QML. The key part here is the invoke action item. Remember, I told you to remember the little share icon on the action bar. That's the result of encoding this in your QML. I've asked it to place this on the action bar. So that's my share button. So how does this work? Basically, the invoke action item, when you click it, is going to invoke a query. Here's the query that it's going to invoke. It says, I want to find any application which is capable of understanding what to do with NDEF data that can possibly write it out to a device or over NFC or write it to a tag. So I say the action is share, and the MIME type is this, NDEF, right? Now, again, this is another part of the same application. Remember, invoke action item. It has a handler. So part of the process is that this particular entry point here is effectively an event that gets triggered. And what happens is that after I press the share, this will get triggered. And this is the point at which I've got to construct the NDEF data that I want to transfer to the helper application that's going to transfer it over NFC for me. So this is what I do it here. In fact, you can do it any way you want. If you can do it in JavaScript, that would be fine. If you can do it you can do it any way you want. In the particular example here, I'm going to show it being done within C++, because that's actually a very useful exercise to learn about some of the nice classes that are available there. And then the last thing I do is actually confirm that I've actually constructed that data. So, how do I actually construct this data? I'm going to build an NDEF record that represents a vCard. And I'm showing this to show you the classes that are available to do this. Some of the helper classes that are available are very, very useful. You could use the low-level BPS C-level APIs to do that. But you know, when you get to sort of byte array manipulation in C++, and it becomes a little bit tedious, there's some classes there to help you. So this was the method that I called from JavaScript. It returns a qbyte array. First thing I do is I create an NDEF record. I also create some other things. I actually create a QString with the MIME type of a vCard. I'm going to make use of those. And I'm using the Qt mobility subset of APIs here in order to create and manipulate NDEF records. Very useful set of classes. It avoids you having to use the sort of lower level APIs. So I create next thing I do is I actually want to create part of the payload of my NDEF message. Part of the payload is a vCard. So I just start building up a vCard. If you know vCard format, you should recognize this. I'm just building up the name, the first name, the address, telephone number, cell number, email address, and the end, building that into a string. Relatively straightforward. I pull this information off the fields in the application. And then, once you've done that, we've got the MIME type, and we've got effectively the vCard payload. We start populating the information into the NDEV record itself. We say the TNF type name format, again using Qt mobility subset, is going to be MIME type because it's a vCard and has a MIME type. So this is a particular type of TNF NDEV record. We populate the MIME type in there, set it to UTF-8. We set the payload of the NDEV message. We take the vCar's vstring, QString we've built, UTF-8, because we want to make it into a byte array. And last of all, we embed that NDEV record inside an NDEV message. And once we do that, we basically, the net result of that was that byte array would be returned into JavaScript, and then we're back into the original part of the application where we presented it as part of the Invocation Framework data attribute. So, relatively straightforward. Nice set of classes to use here to construct things. You don't need to use byte arrays. So let's look at another aspect of sharing information over NFC. We're going to look at the NFC Share Manager. NFC Share Manager is very, very useful for various types of well-known data. And for example, sharing photographs, audio files, large data, media files, or any other type of file, any other type of data as well. NFC Share Manager is effectively a sort of useful wrapper class around many of the NFC capabilities. I'm going to show another demo again here, and then show you how this actually works. So what I'm going to do is, there we go, and I'll switch over to 8. Right. What we're going to do is actually share some files. We're going to share some files between this BlackBerry 10 device and, because it's standards, a BlackBerry 7 device. I'm going to select some files here. Let me take 3 photographs, which are created by my friend Martin, who, as well as an NFC guru, is actually a very good photographer. So, and I say share. Let me touch the 2 devices together, and there we go. And now, there we go. Now what you're actually seeing here is the transfer of 3 large image files between one device and another. We've achieved this through an NFC-based application. How did we do it? You'll also notice that I can move the devices apart. So it's obviously not using NFC to transfer the data, because we know that that's a 1 centimeter type technology. It's actually using Bluetooth. What I've done is I've negotiated a Bluetooth connection between I've negotiated a Bluetooth connection between these 2 devices in order to send the bulk data. NFC is great for small amounts of data, but the use case when you've got to hold them together for a long time, where you transfer a very large file, becomes a little bit tedious and sore on the arms, whereas letting Bluetooth do it for you helps you a lot. So in this case, what we've done is we've used a standard called the NFC Forum Connection Handover Specification, open standards, in which case the NFC stack between the 2 devices negotiates a Bluetooth connection on your behalf. It takes all the hassle of actually negotiating the attributes of Bluetooth for you. It just does it. And the data then was transferred over Bluetooth. So, you know, this is going to be really quite difficult, isn't it, guys? You know, I'm negotiating a Bluetooth connection over NFC, then transferring the files. You know, actually, it's really quite simple. This is it. This is the sum total of your application, which will do all the NFC Bluetooth negotiation. We're using something called NFC Share Manager. NFC Share Manager It works this way. You build a request. The request is a list of files. In this particular case, I would be building a list of files in terms of file URLs for the PNG files that I wanted to transfer, in this case, Ray. I tell the NFC manager I want to share files. And then I pass that request to the NFC manager and say, set share content. And then it does it. It negotiates Bluetooth for you. It transfers the data over Bluetooth. It was as simple as that. So if you've got an application which requires sharing information over Bluetooth like that, large bulk data, get NFC. You can use NFC to negotiate Bluetooth and let Bluetooth do the heavy lifting. It's simple. So, having done the latest and greatest, I'll pass over to Martin for the
other stuff. Thanks, John. So hopefully John's shown you that you can do a great deal with a very small amount of effort using QML, the Invocation Framework, and some of the classes we created from within Cascades. But there's another way, and that other way is called the BlackBerry Platform Services, and this has been there since the very beginning, as I said in the intro, the beginning of time. Okay, beta 1, maybe not the beginning of time. So what is it? It's a set of C functions. And when you work with the BlackBerry Platform Services, your code will involve an event loop. It's a procedural approach. So your code will involve an event loop, a while loop of some sort. You'll be reading event objects from a queue. That's part of the BlackBerry Platform Services framework. And according to the type of event object you get, you'll be taking a certain branch in your logic. Okay? All sorts of events are supported by BPS, and you may not be interested in all of them, so you're going to kind of register and say, tell me about NFC events, I want to know about those, as opposed to things concerning the accelerometer, which maybe you're not interested in. But all the sensors generate events that you can read through this BPS framework and the event-driven, event loop approach. There's lots and lots of good stuff in there. It's a little bit lower level than the stuff John's shown you though. In terms of architecture, just to put that in some kind of context there, your application will be receiving events from the BPS framework, as shown on the right-hand side of the slide here, and making requests to it. But at the same time, it can still use the Qt APIs, which are much higher level, and it can still use Cascades, and it can use QML for its user interface. So those different aspects of the BlackBerry 10 APIs will coexist quite happily, on the whole, in your application. Now I'm going to show you an example of using the BlackBerry Platform Services APIs. And what I've chosen to do is show NFC's peer-to-peer mode. And what we're going to do is, I'm going to show you a game, actually, that will transfer data between player 1 and player 2, and back again, using something called SNEP. And SNEP is the simple NDEF exchange protocol. And you may or may not know that NDEF is the NFC data exchange format. So, that was hard work. SNEP is a protocol that lets me transfer data from A to B. I probably should have just said that. For those that want to know more, it sits on top of, it's a stack, and SNEP sits on top of another protocol called LLCP. That's the Logical Link Control Protocol, which is lower level. It's kind of connection oriented. It's a bit like working with raw TCP/IP sockets. You open connections, you read from streams, and you do that kind of stuff, which you're probably very familiar with, and it has its place. Unless I've got a very good reason to use LLCP, though, I'll always use SNEP in preference, for the simple reason that it's really easy, and I'm a little bit lazy, I suppose, and possibly the best developers are, I don't know. It's quite high level, it's message oriented, it's a doddle to use. So, we'll have a look at this game. I came up with this snappy term that hasn't quite caught on, but I'm going to try it again. I thought of this thing called proximity gaming. It's the idea of games that are somehow enriched by having NFC elements in them, whereby users interact physically by touching devices in some way. I'll show you an example. What we're going to do now is, in fact, I'm going to challenge John. John, do you fancy playing? I'm going to challenge John, my good friend John, to, is that the wrong one? That's the wrong one. Let's try that one. Thank you. Come on, device, work. To a game of what Americans like to call tic-tac-toe. Yeah, I pressed it. I just pressed it. Excuse us. Okay, we have equipment malfunction here.
Try again. There it is.
Okay, and we're back. So we're going to have a game of what Americans call tic-tac-toe, and what we, in the UK, call noughts and crosses. And I'll try and make sure you can see what's going on here. The contrast isn't too good, unfortunately. John's going to play with a BlackBerry 7 device, 9900, and I'm going to keep the BlackBerry 10 device to myself, because this is my part of the session, so I don't see why I shouldn't. And we're going to kick things off by deciding who is player one and who gets to move first. And we do that by touching devices. So, John, shall I start that off? And
why don't you start it off?
Okay,
yeah.
Let's just touch devices. Oh, and I've somehow switched on the camera. That wasn't very clever. So you can probably, actually that's gone horribly wrong because I switched on the camera. Do excuse me one moment. It's not easy being up here, you know. Okay, let me try that again without switching on the camera. I've done it again. Right. So what happened there, and we'll review in a moment, it's very hard to see, I'm sorry about this, is that there was an exchange of messages and one device has been tagged as player one, the BlackBerry 10 device, the other one's player two. So player one can update the board. They've got control, it's unlocked, the other device is locked. So I'm going to very cleverly and strategically, because this is a very strategic game, take the center part of the board, turn over, and John, do you want to find out what move I took? Because he has no idea.
I have no idea. Gosh.
See, John's better at holding the device than I am. He didn't have the, he's been on a special course.
Right.
So
I make a move now,
yeah.
so I'm going to choose that one.
Okay, so if you now turn over. It's tricky to demonstrate this stuff. Oh, he's up to something. He's played this game before. I could be in trouble. So I'm going to go here because, you know, can't think of a better move. Over to you, John.
Right.
Your go, I believe.
My go? You know, in the interest of speed, don't do this.
Okay. It's very exciting, though. I'm sure they're not bored. Not even slightly. Come on. Hands up who hates demos.
You're done with it.
I think if we turn this one over, we'll sign. I don't know. Okay, I think I'm bored with this now. It usually works, honestly. You get the gist. Okay, so, and you won't write horrible things about me on my eval form, will you? Let's go back to the presentation. I think I can rely on PowerPoint anyway. I can. So, what did we just see, kind of? We saw NFC used in two aspects of the game. We started a new game by touching devices, and in fact, there were messages exchanged by both devices in both directions. Each device's instance of the application generated a random number, hung on to their own copy, but sent it across NFC to the other device. Once each had received a number from the other device, they're in possession of both. Whichever number was the highest kind of won the bid and became player one. So that's how NFC was used to choose the player one status. After that, we used it with some success to exchange control of the board, to pass the turn and to indicate what square of the grid had been updated by the player. And we did that by sending a single message containing a cell number from 0 to 8, and and that's it. So that's what we did with NFC. In terms of user interactions, we were just touching devices. And honestly, it's really good fun, or it can be. And we were using SNEP, as you know, rather than LLCP, which I mentioned is another option we could have chosen to use. And we kind of demonstrated some interoperability there as well, because this is a BBOS, BlackBerry 7 device with an application written in Java. This is a BlackBerry 10 device with the same application written with Cascades and C++. So that's pretty good. are we for time? So in the remaining time, and I think we're okay for time, I'm going to explain how you would implement that kind of NFC functionality using the BlackBerry Platform Services APIs to give you a flavor of what it looks like. It's kind of a three-step process. First thing we have to do is register to say, please tell me if another device comes into proximity. That's what we're telling the BlackBerry Platform Services, or BPS, which is easier to say, we'd like to be notified of through an event. We then detect, this is the second stage, the other device coming into proximity, and there are some function calls involved in that. And having detected the other device arriving in our NFC field, we respond by sending some data to it. So it's a three-step process involving various C API calls. Step one, register. Really easy, single function call. All I have to do is call NFC register SNEP client, and that's it. My device is now in the right state to be notified when another SNEP client comes into proximity. That's it. We're now doing peer-to-peer mode NFC. I mentioned event loops earlier on. Hands up who's already seen this event loop type approach in BlackBerry 10 developments. Only a few of you. Okay, so if you're working with these C APIs, you're going to write an event loop. You're going to have some kind of Boolean which will escape you from the loop when you want to, according to your application logic. But within it, you're going to be reading event objects from the BPS framework. And you do so by calling BPS getEvent. Just a method call returns an event object to you. Now, BPS events are classified according to a certain kind of family, or we use the term domain. So sensor events have one domain, NFC events have their own domain. And I will have registered outside this loop to say, it's actually the NFC event types that I'm interested in. So here I'm checking that what I've got actually is one of the NFC ones. So I obtain the domain value from the event object by calling BPS event get domain, check it's what I expected, and then I call my own method handle NFC event. And in here, life's pretty simple. There are 3 NFC event types that I care about in the context of peer-to-peer. Either I've got an NFC SNEP connection event, which means the other device is now in my NFC field, it's arrived. That's my cue to give it some data, send it across the NFC interface. Or I get one of 2 possible event types that tell me the outcome of a previous sending of data across that NFC interface. Either I get NFC endf push succeed event, which means it works, or I get the other one that's really hard to say. Okay, I'll give it a go. NFC endf push failure IO error event. Yay! Which means it didn't work. And so I display a message and I get the user to do it again, or something like that. Now, if I've got the event that tells me the other device has appeared out of nowhere and I want to send it some data, this is the kind of thing that I do. BPS events are like wrapper objects, and inside there I've got an NFC event object which I'm going to obtain. And hiding away inside the NFC event object is something called a target. Now, a target, you can think of it as being like a reference to the other device. And once I've got that target object, I can now talk to or send data to the other device. And to do so, first thing I have to do is create my data in the appropriate format, and that format is endf, the NFC data exchange format. I've got various APIs available to me to make that easy. I can create an endf record, provide it with a payload in the form of a byte array, say what type of data it is. I then create an endf message, because the way endf works is that we have messages and they contain records. It's a hierarchical kind of structure. And I add my record containing my payload to the message. And finally, I send it to the other device just by calling NFC push endf message. So doing similar things to the things you saw John doing, but I'm doing it with this procedural approach using some C APIs. And a lot of the kind of decision-making process over which one you use is personal preference, but there are some other factors that John will run through with you later on. I'm going to finish with this slide, and this is simply an addendum. If you're working with the BlackBerry Platform Services, you're likely to be using this procedural event loop-oriented style of coding. However, we did also provide a class called the Abstract BPS Event Handler which lets you take a more object-oriented style approach. And you can extend this particular class, and you can use its subscribe method to indicate what families or domains of event type you're interested in, and it will make callbacks to your subclass to indicate that events of that type have occurred. So instead of sitting in an event loop and reading from the BPS queue of event objects, you'll get callbacks. Which you use is entirely up to you. It's personal preference. What style of programming do you prefer? So I'm going to hand back to John now. He'll just step back and make some observations about the two approaches.
Thank you, Martin. So when we started out on this journey, we told you what we were going to tell you. You heard what we had to say. Now I'm going to review what we actually told you. There's no right way or wrong way to do it. We have two approaches. One approach, whether it be the the C++ BPS approach, versus the other approach, which is using Qt and QML and cascades. They're simply choices which are based on what's ever appropriate for your application or personal preference. So it's not a choice between good, bad, old, new. They're just different ways of accessing the same sets of services. So first lesson, two approaches, and it depends entirely on what application you're writing. Okay? So if we think about what applications you may be writing, what might be more appropriate? Well, suppose you're writing a gaming application, perhaps or an application that's based around perhaps OpenGL, in which case you're already probably using BPS to handle screen events and then handing them off to OpenGL. Then they're probably very good candidates for using the BPS-C APIs because you're already using that framework. And they're just different types of events within the same framework. So for that type of application, BPS is probably a very good choice for you. If your applications are more based around cascades, QML, and JavaScript, then you're already using QML, you're already using the Invocation Framework. So, the approach of using the Invocation Framework in QML is probably a very good approach for you. There are differences. In BPS, you can do everything and anything. Not all of the use cases are accessible through the Invocation QML approach. Things like you can't do card emulation through the QML approach at the moment. You can't you do those. But if you want to do those sort of things, use the BPS approach because you can mix and match. So it has the benefit where you can actually mix and match a lot of those things. In summary, Invocation Framework, probably less NFC coding required. You're not manipulating byte arrays probably yourself. You're not handling events. Not everything is possible. Actual fact, the Invocation Framework may in fact provide part of the user interface for you. You saw the example of a card coming in and interacting with you. So part of the UI is there. With BPS, you can do anything you want. You can complete control over the user interface. Any NFC capabilities are supported. There's more work because you probably have to do more of the heavy lifting. So it's a choice you have to make, and the choice is not right or wrong, good or bad. It's between what is the most appropriate one for your application that you're developing, and that's down to you guys. So, well, tomorrow we're going to be, we have a lab tomorrow. You can get your hands dirty with some real NFC coding. We have a couple of exercises in this lab which are meant to be quite fun and educational as well, focusing on the NFC parts. It's triggering events by tags, transferring data using peer-to-peer. So come to that, come and visit us. I think you would have fun. Again, a set of resources. We write a lot of articles. We publish them. You'll find them, the index for that at that tiny URL up there. All the code that all the articles that we write and the sample code that we write is all available on GitHub and under the Cascades Community Samples. I would use that as a good starting point. If you've got an idea for an application, use this resource. You know, we've spent probably a year or so going through and discovering.
We have. Don't step back.
First,
I'm going to lose John. There's a big gap at the back here.
Gap,
okay.
Yeah. Use it as a good resource. Yeah. Use it as a good resource for figuring out what your application requires, whether any of the patterns there that we've described in our examples and source code match yours. You know, take the code, use it. It's open source. Somebody's been down that path before you, like us. And if you want to ask questions, we've got Twitter handles there. Follow us. It allows us to answer questions that you may have and interact with you. Martin and myself tend to deal with EMEA and sometimes APAC sort of interaction as well. Our colleague in North America is Rob Williams. Follow us and we'll help you and we'll answer your questions. So, the mobile conference guide can be downloaded from BlackBerry World there. Have a look at it. Make sure you fill in your citizen surveys, please. You know, they're, you know, we get marked on these sort of things. And you can use your BlackBerry 10 device to do this. And there's an event tonight, which is the JAM Europe Appreciation event in the Europa foyer in this building, the RAI. So I hope you've enjoyed this session. Thank you very much from Martin and myself.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we're really short of time.
We've probably got, we need to be out pretty sharpish. We've got about 3 minutes maybe for some questions. So if we go past the 1/4 we'll move outside and have a conversation out there because the handover to the next session is extremely tight. So if there's any questions, or if you want to grab us when we go out there, we can do that.
We're here for the whole 2 days. So if anyone wants to chat, please do come and see us, whether it's about NFC or anything else.
Right. We'll hover around outside for a little while.
Favourite movie?
Thank you.
Whatever you like. Thank you.
Thank you.